So I had, as I do from time to time, I had a specific person in mind as I wrote this lesson. I wonder sometimes if those folks I have in mind when I write a lesson know it, and I wonder if Randy knows it tonight. But all joking aside, I was talking about this the other day with some folks and about, some of those situations we all encounter from time to time, and where, somebody on the road does something that was foolish or immature at best, life-threatening at worst. How do you respond to those type of drivers? How do you respond to those type of situations? This isn't a sermon subject that you hear too often. In fact, it's one I don't think I've ever heard really spoken on as an entire lesson in itself, but I began to think about it and how sometimes we don't react as good as we ought to when we're behind the wheel. Sometimes our behavior changes, and we spend a lot of time in the car, do we not? I think for most everybody here, whether it's not necessarily a long length of time throughout the day, I think most everybody here at least drives in a car mostly on a daily basis. Some people do spend hours at a time in any given day in the car. This is something that a lot of our lives is dedicated to. This is where we spend a lot of our time is in the car. And so doesn't that warrant a little bit of discussion from a biblical standpoint as to how we should behave, how we should respond to drivers who do, what we might call stupid things? How do we respond to that? How do we react when people do something that is mean? Do we respond in kind? Because a lot of times we become a different person when we're behind the wheel. And so I want to just ask the simple question, why is that? And, what can we do to avoid this? So we just need to acknowledge that sometimes driving brings out the worst in people. And I did a lesson a couple of years ago about the Christian and social media, things like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and the like, and how we should treat others. And my overall conclusion on that lesson was, why do the rules change just because it's not face-to-face? The golden rule, we should do unto others as we would want them to do to us, or treat others the way you want to be treated. Shouldn't that still apply even if it's just typing a message to somebody, on the other side of the country? We should still treat them the same, whether it's face-to-face or via social media. And, I think the same thing is true when it comes to being behind the wheel as a Christian. The same rules that apply to how we treat people face-to-face, that ought to be how we treat people while we're driving. But I'd like to share with you just a few of my observations, and this is sensitive territory for everybody here. We're stepping on everybody's toes tonight, so this is just my observations, having struggled with this myself from time to time, wondering if I have the right attitude, if I treat others the way I should treat them, and wondering why do I treat them differently just because we're now in vehicles. I wouldn't treat somebody like this face-to-face. So here's just a few of my observations, how sometimes driving can bring the worst out of us, and we need to watch for this. We need to watch for these attitudes and behaviors, because sometimes I don't know what it is about driving a car and being in traffic with other motorists, but I think these bad attitudes tend to come to the surface. These, just simply bad attitudes. You ever notice how you have a tendency to become much more prone to being judgmental when you're driving the car? Just because somebody cuts you off, that does not make them a child trafficking drug dealer who lives in a crack house in downtown, but that's immediately what we think. We think of that person, they're the worst of the worst scum in the world. It's so easy to just immediately jump to a conclusion and assume the worst about the motives of the other driver. And I'm going to share some situations that I suspect most everybody here can relate to. You come to a traffic signal, and it's obvious that the person pulls up next to you. They're not in the correct lane, and so they want to zip in front of you and get over. And you think, why didn't you get in the right lane in the first place? I'm not going to let you get in front of me. We just assume that they're trying to get ahead. Yet I thought to myself, how often am I going to somebody's house in a part of town that I don't often visit, and By the way, that Centerville exit, anytime I go to McPherson's house, there is no way to pick the correct lane getting off that exit. It's just impossible. And I do that all the time where I'm like, sorry, I need to get in front of you, or behind you, I picked the wrong lane, but I didn't mean to. I do that all the time. So I want them to assume the best in me. I want them to assume I'm unfamiliar with that, and it is a really confusing off-ramp. Yet when I'm driving, I instantly assume they're just trying to go faster than me. They just think they need to be ahead of me. Well, what if they don't know this area too well? What if they just made an honest mistake? So we easily jump to conclusions and we assume the worst in others. And we're going to talk about this in just a minute on our next point, but we so easily assume the worst in others, yet think the best of ourselves, right? A little more on that in just a second. But let's go to Matthew chapter 7. Again, what I'd like to do is just relate how the way we treat others while behind the wheel, it really shouldn't change. The same rules should apply. So I'm just going to read some scriptures that show us how we should normally think to interact with people and how we should still apply that thought process to the situations where we're driving. In Matthew chapter 7, everybody knows verse 1. Few people read the next 4 verses after that. But judge not, lest you be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. And why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. The main teaching of this passage is not, it's forbidden to ever make a judgment against anybody. No, it's don't be a hypocrite. Understand that the way you judge others, that's the same standard will be judged back to you, measured back to you. So don't be a hypocrite. Don't go pointing out the little mistakes somebody does when you've got huge, huge flaws in your life. I always like the image that this illustration in Matthew 7 conjures up, a guy with a 2x4 sticking out of his face, saying, let me get that out of your eye, let me get that little speck. And so just reminding us not to rush to judgment. In Matthew 13, among the other qualities of love, it says that love hopes all things and love believes all things. We should hope the best and generally give people the benefit of the doubt, even if we don't think they're worth it or deserve it. And so let's just be careful not to immediately judge the motives of those around us. Hopefully we don't do that in face-to-face interactions. We try to give people a little bit of understanding. We try to have a little bit of empathy and realize I've made the exact same mistakes too. I'm not perfect. Why should I judge their minor flaw when I do just the same thing or worse at times? So just be cautious that a lot of times driving brings out this really judgmental side of us, that we rush to condemn those around us. But again, we oftentimes fail to apply the same measure or standard of judgment to ourselves. I often think when people are talking about their driving skills, their flawless driving skills, that we're a lot like the disciples in Matthew chapter 18. Which of us is best? Who is the greatest driver in the world? I think I might be top 10. I'm pretty good at parallel parking, but this is how we react to it. We always instantly think, I'm never the one at fault. It's always somebody else's fault. There's always some way you can twist it to say it's the other guy's fault. Like, yeah, I rear-ended him, but he stopped so quickly, and well, we shouldn't have been falling so close. A lot of times we don't want to honestly look at ourselves because we all make mistakes and we need to be honest about our failures. Matthew chapter 18 and verse 1, at that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And he called a child to himself and set him before them and said, truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I used to make fun of Jessica because as a teenager, she backed her car into her parents' Suburban. And so I told her, you're not allowed to drive because you're going to wreck our car. You're going to back it into something. And About 3 years into our marriage, we're at a hotel in California, and I've got the car in reverse, I'm ready to back out, and then we start talking about something, and in the meantime, a car pulls in behind us that I didn't see, and so then when we're done talking, I go to reverse, and that car was just backed right into it. That happens to us. We just think we're the best. We don't make the same mistakes to other people until we do. It happens. So let's not become proud. Let's not overestimate our abilities. Let's understand we're all flawed. We all make mistakes. We're all human. Another one of those bad attitudes that shows up a lot of times when we're driving is selfishness or indifference towards others. We kind of look around at the cars on the road with us and view them as obstacles at times, when we should be looking at cars full of souls. The roads are filled with men, women, and children with an eternal soul that is created in the image of our God and Father in heaven. And we need to remember that fact always. I've been reading this scripture a lot privately, but also it's been coming up a lot in Bible classes, and I can't seem to escape the significance of Ephesians chapter 2, looking in verse 3, at just how difficult this standard seems to be at times. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit. And can you say that about the way you drive? None of my decisions in driving are based on selfishness. And that word nothing, that's a tough pill to swallow. That leaves no room for anything else. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. And again, I want you to think about how this verse would apply to situations where you're driving, because it's really no different. Yes, the particulars are different. We're in a fast-moving vehicle, but really, this same rule applies. We need to look around at others on the road with us and say, I need to look out for them. I need to be mindful of those people, those souls. And I better not do anything to put them at jeopardy. How selfish is it to be, texting away on your cell phone or checking sports scores or Facebook or whatever, taking your attention away from where it needs to be. Those things are really serious issues we need to pay attention to, because it's simply selfishness. It's indifference. When you take your eyes away and your attention away from what you're doing, you're putting lives at risk. And so that's one of those attitudes that pops up. You see it all the time. People are just so caught up in what they're doing, they become so self-absorbed that they're unaware of how dangerous they're being to other people. And that really gets me. That's what really gets me upset when I see people that don't have a real disregard for the lives of others. And one situation, there was a guy who was just weaving all over the highway trying to get in front of people, and there's no giving the benefit of the doubt to this guy. You could tell what his motives were. He was just driving like a maniac, and as he passed me, I saw that he had a little girl in a car seat in the back. And then about 3 or 4 car lengths in front, he was swerving really fast, and his car turned sideways and was skidding sideways, and we all had to hit our brakes really hard, and then he spun the other way and ended up rolling off the side of the highway. And I thought, I hope that's a wake-up call for this guy. And then not more than 2 minutes later, he goes zooming past me again. And that just infuriated me, and I hope I don't do the same kind of things, where I just recklessly endanger the lives of others, because it's simply selfishness. So that's an attitude that pops up when we're driving too sometimes. And rudeness. This is one that might hit home for a lot of people, myself included. What an idiot. You ever said something like that? I think we have this perception that there's kind of like different tiers of insults or bad words that, yeah, there are certain words we cannot call people. We cannot use those names. Those are bad words. Yet there's kind of second tier, idiot, jerk, moron, dummy. We kind of say things like that. Like, those aren't as bad. We're allowed to call people those things. But when we look at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus really asks us to look at the motives or intent of our heart. It's not so much what we're saying, but it's what we're feeling behind the words we say. Go to Matthew chapter 5. Just because they can't hear what we're saying, I don't think that makes a difference. In the eyes of God, if we're saying rude things or things with mean intention towards other people, I think God takes exception to that. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 21. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. And so the Jews basically understood this, that you can hate somebody, you can despise them inwardly, but as long as that doesn't boil over into actually physically harming them, you're fine. You can still be righteous. So that's what they said. As long as you don't cross this line, as long as you don't commit murder, anything up to, but excluding that is fine. And Jesus says no in verse 23. Verse 22. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And that's what Jesus is addressing here. It's not so much what words you choose to describe somebody or call them. It's about the anger in your heart that is directed towards them. And whoever shall say to his brother, Raka. In my footnote says Aramaic for empty head or good for nothing. That was an expression that was genuinely offensive to them. And he says, anybody that says that shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever shall say, you fool. And that Greek word is where we get our modern, word for moron. Whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. And what we have here is kind of what I described. To the Jews, they admitted Raka was a very bad word. But Jesus says, they had no problem calling somebody a fool, but Jesus said, these two, even though you look at them as one's bad, one's okay, Jesus said, this one makes you guilty before the Supreme Court. This one puts you in fiery hell. So it's actually, he's not talking about which words you choose to say. That's not the point. It's what's in your heart. And so think about that. Rude behavior, rude gestures, rude words. It doesn't matter if they see you doing it or not. It doesn't matter if they can't hear you. But we're not supposed to be rude people. We're not supposed to have anger in our hearts towards others. That's a challenge, isn't it? Do nothing from selfishness, that's a challenge. Don't be angry with the guy who just cut you off in traffic. That seems nearly impossible at times, but that's what it means to be a Christian. To live for that high standard. So just understand, you're going to encounter some very rude people, but we don't need to respond in kind. And that brings us to our next point about retaliation. And I know you know what this is. It's when somebody cuts you off, so you turn your brights on. Or get up real close, right at their tailgate, You're mad at them, so you want to respond and retaliate and do something to get back at them. The road is one of the places I think retaliation is most likely to occur. That's how road rage happens. Somebody cuts you off, so then you get up on their tailgate, then they brake check you and slam on their brakes. And does it sound like I know this a little too well? Like I said, I'm stepping on my own toes here. And then the guy starts, rolling down his window and yelling stuff and throwing stuff at the next car, and it escalates into, really ugly things. We've all seen cool YouTube videos about that stuff. But it gets really ugly. Retaliation is not something that the Christian should engage in. Again, we go to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. These same rules apply equally to when we're on the road. That's my main point tonight. Matthew chapter 5. This time, I want you to notice verse 38. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist him who is evil. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Says the point is, it's better to let something go than it is to retaliate. Retaliation leads to really ugly behavior. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9. This is a very concise scripture. Hopefully we remember this next time we're tempted to retaliate. Let the words of 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9 really sink in. Not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. That seems counterintuitive to this world. But again, that's what it means to be a Christian, to do things differently than those around us. We oftentimes see a disregard for laws. Okay, going 56 miles an hour in a 55 mile an hour zone is not what I'm talking about here. But we know in Romans 13 that we need to respect governing authorities and the governments are there to punish wrongdoers, and they're far from perfect at it, but I would not like to live in a country where there is no government. I would not like to live in a country where there is no justice system. As imperfect or flawed as ours might be, it's still the line between us and absolute chaos. And so we need to respect the laws and the governing authorities. And so, again, I know some people, some Christians that make a big deal that if you go 1 mile an hour over the speed limit, well, you're in sin. No, you're not. I don't want to get into a whole sermon about that, but you're not. But we do need to respect the laws. We need to be somewhere in the neighborhood of the speed limit. We probably shouldn't be rolling through stop signs. These might seem like small things to you. And some people, I don't think, realize that little stick on the side of the steering wheel is a turn indicator. Use it. It helps those around you. These might seem like small things, but when we respect the small things, that sets a precedent or a pattern in our life where we respect the bigger things. A little hinge will swing a big door. Little changes in your life can have far sweeping consequences than you realize and make bigger changes than you realize. What kind of driver would Jesus be? That seems like a silly question, but give that some honest thought. He'd probably be pretty close to the speed limit. It might seem like a small thing, but I bet he'd stop all the way at a stop sign or use his blinkers. But a lot of times we just think if nobody's watching, it's not wrong. Is that the kind of precedent you want to set for yourself? It seems like minor things, but it really sets the stage for other things to come. And we think about setting a bad example, and this was a really big issue when, the Jesus fish stickers were really popular, that really just said, hey, I'm a Christian and I'm the one that just cut you off. But when people know who you are, you want to set a good example. I don't know what it is about being in the car that makes us feel like we can be an entirely different person. There was a really, really, really funny reality show that was on many years ago where it was people that rented cars and they had hidden cameras in there. And so they just see what people did. They'd record them singing along to the radio. And it was really funny. When you think you're by yourself, you become somebody so different. Sometimes it's funny when singing along to the radio, but other times it's not so funny when people see you doing something bad. When you're listening to crude and worldly music cranked up really loudly. People hear that and then they see your face, and what are they to assume? You're no different than anybody else. They judge you by the content of the music you're listening to. When we feel like nobody's watching us, when we feel like we're anonymous, we feel like that gives us liberty to behave differently, but it doesn't, because God is always watching us. We can't afford to set a bad example. We can't afford to damage our ability to positively influence those around us Look at Colossians chapter 4. Colossians chapter 4, and I'm going to read verses 5 and 6. Conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned, as it were, with salt, so that you may know how you should respond to each person. Because we need to make the most of every opportunity. We need to conduct ourselves with wisdom toward outsiders. In high school, there was a guy he was just the kind of guy that nobody liked. And thinking about him this last week as I was looking at this lesson, I really have nothing but pity, because I doubt he really had many friends. He was the kind of person that was constantly obnoxious, would always just be doing things just to upset people or just to mess around with them. But I don't think he really had any friends. So one day in school, he cut me off in the parking lot, only to have us both sit in line for another 10 minutes waiting to get out behind the school buses. And so he just cut me off, and I didn't like this guy to begin with, and then he gave me an excuse to be mad at him again. And he's sitting right in front of me, so my car is full of garbage, it still is today, and I find a soda can back there, and I go up my moonroof and chuck it at his truck. Hit the truck, and it lands in his, flatbed, and I'm thinking, all right, I did something cool. I got back at him. But really, I burned the bridge. It felt good in the moment, but I was setting a bad example. And I don't think that guy ever would have listened to me if I tried to open the Bible with him. And I don't think he ever would have come to me if he had a legitimate Bible question, because he looked at me differently after that. I set a very bad example that day. And that's something that's always stuck with me and reminded me I can't afford to ruin my ability to influence others for good. And so we need to remember that just because we're in a car, just because we're by ourselves, doesn't mean we can be a different person. We still got to act like a Christian. So just a few final thoughts. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 16 talks about making the most of our time, or redeeming the time. To redeem something is to, buy it back, to make it useful. And it's easy to let the stress of driving in traffic bring out the worst in us. And so we need to watch when those attitudes start to pop up and really fight against them, because the same rules that apply in treating others face to face, they apply when we're behind the wheel dealing with other motorists. So we need to watch, and it's easy to let driving bring out the worst in us, but as Christians, we need to aim for better. And so I'd like to give you a few suggestions on how you can make the most or redeem the time that you do spend in your car. Just a few suggestions. Some of them are more significant than others. This is just something that, you ever been the recipient of it, makes you feel pretty good. And you're in line at a drive-thru, getting coffee or getting breakfast or something, pay for the person behind you. And maybe tell the cashier, give them one of our business cards and just say, give that to them too, so they know who did it. I was at a church once, and I thought this was a really cool idea. They had business cards that were intended for this very thing. If you didn't want to go up and say, hey, I'm the guy that bought your lunch or something, you don't want to make a big deal, you don't want the praise, that's not why you're doing it, but you also want them to know there was the reason behind it is you're a Christian. And that's the way Christians like to treat people, with kindness. And they had these little business cards that just said, this random act of kindness was provided by a member of blank, whatever church it was. And it was just a little card you could leave behind if you ever did something like that. So, it's just one of those fun little ideas. But a little more significantly, get in the habit of yielding to others. Like I said, a little hinge or a small hinge will swing a big door. Sometimes when we focus on making little changes in our life, it will have the biggest impact on our overall behavior. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 24, if we're in the habit in our car of yielding to others, yielding the right of way, maybe we'll be in the habit of doing that in more spiritually significant matters. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, life is about more than just insisting on having things your way. Let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. And he talks about how, all things that are lawful, but has to be profitable, has to be something that edifies or builds up others as well. So get in the habit of, yielding right of way to others. Even if you get there at the same time, wave them on. Just be kind and get in that habit. That's a good habit to be in. Rather than insisting on you, yield to somebody else. And spend a little time in the car praying. Turn off that radio for a while. We turn on the radio when we've got a long drive ahead of us. We turn on the iPod because we want music to help the time pass by quicker. But you're missing out on a golden opportunity to have time by yourself. If you got little kids and you have to drive somewhere by yourself, that's precious silence. You don't get that always at home. Utilize that as a time to, I know you got to have some attention on the road, so it might not be your best prayer time, but it's still time where you could let your thoughts turn to God. Spend some time praying. And especially if you're embarking on a long road trip, or if you know you're headed into rush hour traffic. If you know there might be some stressful situations coming up, pray for patience. That can be really helpful. 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 17 says, pray at all times or pray without ceasing. Car is a good place to do that. Help someone that's stranded and use caution, use good judgment on this one. I hesitate to bring this one up, but I'm also reminded of the fact, because there are some people that just, I don't know, some situations you just might look at it and think, this doesn't feel right, this doesn't feel safe, and that's okay, but I'm also reminded of the fact that love is all about acts of kindness to those who are in need. In Matthew 25, it talks about feeding the hungry or clothing the naked, visiting those in prison, helping those who are sick. It's about doing for others. In Luke chapter 10, we're reminded of the Good Samaritan. Well, who is my neighbor? What does it look like to love my neighbor is the question Jesus was asked, and told a story about a guy who was beaten up and left for dead and said, 3 people, only one of them helps him. Who's the guy that loved his neighbor? Well, obviously the one that helped the person in need. So I know we can't always in every situation, and if you're more likely to damage their car than help, maybe you're not the right person, but maybe pull over and say, do you need to use a phone? You don't necessarily have to let them in your car or something, but just be cautious about this. Be wise about how you do this, but also when you have opportunity to help someone when you're driving, go ahead. And one final thought. Listen to something good. Hymns or sermons. I even like turning on the radio stations that are Catholic or other denominations. I kind of like listening to their stuff too and picking it apart and thinking about, a lot of times I never realized. I hear something that I never realized that's why they believe that. It's kind of interesting. Maybe it's not exactly the right interpretation of the Bible as I understand it, but it still gives me something to think about. Sometimes I hear that and I say, that doesn't sound right. And immediately I'm thinking about the Bible, thinking about, well, what's wrong about what they just said? What about this other scripture? That kind of has some weight on this, doesn't it? And I start kind of having this internal debate. So, listen to something that is good, something that is Bible-focused. Listen to hymns. Many of you know the Narrow Way a cappella group. I love listening to their songs, and I switch between all 4 parts when I'm singing along. And that's what it says in James chapter 5 and verse 13. Is anybody cheerful? Let them sing praises to God. That's a natural reaction. We sing together, but there's nothing wrong with singing when you're by yourself. And when you're by yourself in the car, it's kind of a free pass, like when you're in the shower. You can just sing as loud as you want, and nobody will judge you. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, this is what I'll leave you with. We talked about this at our group meeting last night, and someone called this a filter passage. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there's any excellence and if anything worthy of praise, let your mind dwell on these things. If you're going to spend a lot of time in the car, have your mind focused on those things that are worth your time. So just a few thoughts, some things to avoid, some really bad attitudes we ought to avoid in the car that sometimes driving brings out. The same rules apply face-to-face as they do on the road, and a few suggestions, and there's so many more things. My whole point is just look at your time that you spend in the car. Sometimes it's just a necessary evil. We got to do it. It's how we commute. But look for opportunities to make something good of it. We're going to sing the invitation song now, and I don't know entirely how this lesson transitions into an invitation to be baptized in the name of Christ for remission of sins, but we certainly would like to recognize this as a convenient opportunity that if you've heard anything in the Bible that has moved you in the direction to obey God, or if you're here tonight and maybe your attitudes, you've had some of these bad attitudes yourself. You need to work on those things. If you need prayers or encouragement, we make this a convenient opportunity. If you come forward now as we stand and sing.